Autumn, 1944. The Philippines. Rain hammers down on twisted metal and broken concrete in a bombed-out factory. Commander Takeshi Yamamoto stares at 3 captured Sherman tanks, his orders crystal clear. Find the Americans' technological secrets. His younger brother died just 2 months ago, when his own tank was destroyed by one of these very machines. Yamamoto carries that rage like a stone in his chest. He expects to discover advanced armor plating, superior weaponry, some mechanical advantage that made these tanks so deadly. But when he pries open the first Sherman, he finds something impossible. The ammunition storage has been converted into medical supply compartments. Makeshift stretchers hang from the walls, personal modifications everywhere, not for killing, but for saving lives. A hand-carved wooden cross dangles from the gunner's seat. Behind it, a photo of an American soldier with his young daughter. This wasn't the barbaric war machine described in Japanese propaganda. This was something else entirely. The critical design flaw wasn't mechanical, it was dangerously human. If you want to hear more incredible untold stories from history that challenge everything you thought you knew, hit that subscribe button. And let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. It's amazing to see how far these forgotten stories can travel. The rain fell in sheets across the bombed-out factory in Leyte, each drop striking the twisted metal of the roof with a sound like distant gunfire. Commander Takeshi Yamamoto stood in the doorway, water dripping from the brim of his cap as he surveyed the 3 captured Sherman tanks that squatted in the shadows like sleeping beasts. The air hung thick with the smell of oil, rust, and something else. The lingering ghost of cordite that never quite left places where men had died. His aide, Lieutenant Sato, shifted nervously behind him. "Sir, the engineers are ready to begin the detailed examination whenever you give the order." Yamamoto nodded, but didn't move. 2 months. It had been exactly 2 months since he'd received the telegram about his younger brother Hiroshi. The memory of that moment still cut through him like shrapnel, the way his hands had shaken as he read the terse military language that reduced his brother's life to a few cold sentences. Killed in action when Type 97 tank destroyed by enemy Sherman. No mention of how Hiroshi had probably called out for their mother in those final seconds, or how his crew had been burned alive in the metal coffin that was supposed to protect them. "These machines," Yamamoto murmured, his voice barely audible above the rain. "They took everything." Carlos, the Filipino translator assigned to his unit, stood quietly in the corner. The man was perhaps 50, with weathered hands and eyes that seemed to hold decades of careful observation. He'd lost family to both sides of this war, yet somehow maintained an air of patient dignity that Yamamoto found both puzzling and oddly comforting. Carlos never spoke unless spoken to, but his presence felt steadying in a way that reminded Yamamoto of his grandfather's gardener back home, someone who understood that silence could be its own form of wisdom. "Sir?" Sato prompted again. Yamamoto straightened his shoulders and walked toward the first tank. His engineering training from Tokyo University kicked in as he began his visual inspection, noting the obvious battle damage, the way the armor plating had been scorched, but not penetrated. These Shermans were well-built machines, but that wasn't what he was looking for. Tokyo wanted to know about their weaknesses, their design flaws, anything that could give Japanese tank crews an advantage in future engagements. He climbed onto the tank's hull and dropped through the commander's hatch into the cramped interior. The smell hit him immediately, not just oil and metal, but something else. Something that made him pause. Medical alcohol, bandages, the unmistakable scent of iodine. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the hatch, Yamamoto's breath caught in his throat. Where ammunition storage should have dominated the space, someone had installed makeshift medical compartments. Rolled bandages sat neatly organized in modified ammunition racks. Bottles of morphine and plasma were secured in padded holders, where shells should have been stored. Stretcher supports had been welded to the walls with the kind of precision that spoke of hours of careful modification. "This is impossible," he whispered, running his fingers along the expertly crafted brackets that held medical supplies. Someone had spent considerable time and skill converting this war machine into something else entirely. Someone who cared more about saving lives than taking them. His hand froze when he spotted the wooden cross. It hung from a thin cord attached to the gunner's position, hand-carved with obvious care. The wood was worn smooth from handling, and tiny scratches covered its surface, hash marks, perhaps counting days or prayers or lives saved. Behind the cross, tucked into a gap between two instrument panels, was a photograph. Yamamoto pulled it free with trembling fingers. The black and white image showed a young American soldier, probably the gunner, based on where it had been hidden, kneeling beside a little girl who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. The child was laughing, her arms wrapped around the soldier's neck, and his expression was so tender, so completely human, that Yamamoto felt something crack inside his chest. This was the enemy. This man who kept his daughter's picture close to his heart while he converted his tank into a mobile hospital. This was the barbaric monster that Japanese propaganda had trained him to hate. "Commander," Carlos's quiet voice came from above. "Is everything all right, sir?" Yamamoto stared at the photograph for a long moment, his throat tight. The little girl in the picture looked remarkably like his own niece back in Kyoto. Same bright eyes, same innocent smile. If this American soldier was a father, then he knew what it meant to love something more than your own life. He knew what it meant to fight, not just for victory, but for the chance to return home to small arms and bedtime stories. "Sir?" Sato called down. "What have you found?" Yamamoto carefully tucked the photograph back into its hiding place, his hands unsteady. Everything he'd believed about this war, about the enemy, about the righteousness of their cause, it was all shifting beneath his feet, like sand in an earthquake. These tanks weren't just weapons. They were homes, sanctuaries, places where human compassion had somehow survived the machinery of war. The rain continued its relentless drumming on the factory roof as Yamamoto climbed out of the tank, his mind reeling with implications he wasn't ready to face. 2 more Shermans waited for his inspection, and he suspected they would only deepen the mystery of who their enemies really were. The second Sherman tank revealed its secrets reluctantly, like a diary written in a foreign language. Yamamoto spent the better part of an hour cataloging what appeared to be standard modifications, reinforced radio equipment, additional periscopes, improved ventilation systems, military efficiency at its finest. But then, wedged beneath the driver's seat in a waterproof pouch, he discovered something that stopped him cold. A leather-bound journal, its pages filled with careful handwriting in English. Carlos translated slowly, his voice growing quieter with each entry, as the true nature of the tank crew's activities became clear. These weren't battle reports or tactical observations. They were something far more dangerous to everything Yamamoto thought he understood about war. December 15th, Carlos read, his accent making the English words sound almost musical. Today we shared our K rations with a group of Filipino children hiding in the rubble near the bridge. Tommy said we couldn't spare the food, but how do you explain hunger to a 6-year-old? Sergeant O'Brien overruled him. We always find a way to stretch what we have. Carlos paused, glancing up at Yamamoto. Should I continue, sir? Yamamoto nodded, though his throat felt tight. The name O'Brien was appearing frequently in the entries, clearly the tank commander, a man who seemed more concerned with feeding hungry civilians than following military protocol. December 20th. found 3 wounded Japanese soldiers in a bombed-out church. 2 were unconscious. 1 kept apologizing in broken English. O'Brien ordered us to treat their wounds before moving them to our POW collection point. Said a man bleeding to death stops being an enemy and starts being someone's son. I think he's right, though I'll never admit it in any official report. The words hit Yamamoto like physical blows. Japanese soldiers treated with medical care by the same tank, crew that had killed his brother. It seemed impossible, yet here was the evidence in careful handwriting, documented day after day. These Americans weren't the savage beasts described in propaganda broadcasts. They were men struggling to maintain their humanity in the midst of mechanized slaughter. Lieutenant Sato shifted uncomfortably. Sir, these could be fabricated documents, propaganda designed to confuse our intelligence efforts. But Yamamoto was already moving toward the 3rd tank, driven by a terrible need to know the complete truth. This Sherman showed the most extensive modifications yet. The entire rear section had been converted into what could only be described as a mobile aid station. Medical supplies were organized with military precision: bandages, morphine, sulfa powder, blood plasma, even a small surgical kit wrapped in sterile cloth. Someone had welded brackets to hold stretchers, installed better lighting, and created storage for medical equipment that went far beyond standard first aid supplies. A small placard was mounted near the medical station, written in multiple languages: English, Filipino, and surprisingly, Japanese. Carlos translated the Japanese portion. For all wounded, regardless of uniform, in mercy, we find our truest strength. Yamamoto stared at the placard for a long time, his hands trembling. The Japanese characters were written by someone who understood not just the language, but its deeper cultural meanings. Whoever had created this mobile hospital had taken the time to learn Japanese well enough to write about mercy and strength in terms that would resonate with Japanese soldiers. "There's more, sir," Carlos said quietly. He pointed to a small notebook hanging from a chain near the medical supplies. Inside were sketches, detailed drawings of medical procedures, anatomical diagrams, but also something unexpected: portraits of faces. Japanese faces, Filipino faces, American faces, all rendered with careful attention to individual humanity. Each sketch was labeled not with military designations, but with names and brief personal details. Kenji from Osaka misses his grandmother's cooking. Roberto from Manila, worried about his pregnant wife. Danny from Chicago, carries letters from his little sister. The last sketch made Yamamoto's breath catch. It was his brother Hiroshi, unmistakably, though the artist had never seen him alive. The drawing was based on his army identification photo, but somehow the unknown American artist had captured something beyond the military formality: a gentleness in the eyes, a hint of the boy who used to build model airplanes and dream of becoming an engineer like his older brother. Below the sketch, in careful Japanese characters, someone had written, "Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamamoto, beloved brother. His sacrifice honors his family and country. May he find peace." Yamamoto's vision blurred as he stared at the impossible drawing. Someone in this tank crew had taken the time to honor his brother's memory, to see past the uniform to the human being beneath. They had documented Hiroshi not as an enemy casualty, but as someone worthy of respect and remembrance. "Sir?" Sato's voice seemed to come from very far away. "What are your orders regarding these irregularities?" Yamamoto closed the notebook carefully, his hands no longer steady. Everything he'd believed about this war was crumbling around him like the bombed-out walls of the factory. These tanks weren't just military equipment. They were floating sanctuaries where compassion had somehow survived the brutal machinery of war. The enemy he'd been trained to hate had proven themselves capable of extraordinary mercy, even toward those who had killed their comrades. The rain continued its steady percussion on the metal roof as Yamamoto climbed down from the tank, knowing that he could never write the report Tokyo expected. How could he document American military weaknesses when their greatest flaw was their dangerous capacity for human kindness? The POW camp sat like a scar on the landscape, barbed wire gleaming dully in the afternoon sun. Yamamoto had spent 3 sleepless nights wrestling with his decision before finally requesting permission to interview the captured American tank commander. The official reason he'd given was intelligence gathering. The truth was far more complicated. He needed to understand how a man could transform an instrument of death into a sanctuary of healing. Lieutenant Sato walked beside him, clipboard in hand, clearly uncomfortable with the irregularity of the request. "Sir, I still don't understand why we're interviewing a single prisoner when we have dozens of captured Americans. Surely the infantry commanders would provide more strategic intelligence." Yamamoto didn't respond immediately. How could he explain that the journals and medical modifications had haunted his dreams? That he'd found himself staring at his brother's photograph each morning, wondering if Hiroshi would have approved of converting ammunition storage into medical supplies? The questions burning inside him had nothing to do with military strategy and everything to do with the terrible possibility that they'd been wrong about everything. The camp commandant, Major Ishida, met them at the gate with barely concealed irritation. "Commander Yamamoto, I must protest this unusual request. Sergeant O'Brien is scheduled for transfer to Manila tomorrow with the other prisoners. This interview disrupts our carefully maintained schedule." "1 hour," Yamamoto replied. "That's all I need." The prisoner they brought to the small interrogation room was not what Yamamoto had expected. Sergeant Mike O'Brien was thin from weeks of captivity, his uniform patched and faded, but his eyes held a quiet strength that reminded Yamamoto of the Buddhist monks who had taught him patience as a child. There was no hatred in those eyes, no defiance, just a weary dignity that seemed unbreakable. Carlos took his position as translator, though O'Brien's first words suggested it might not be necessary. "You speak some English, don't you, Commander?" His voice was soft, almost gentle, with an accent Yamamoto couldn't place. "Some?" Yamamoto admitted, surprised by the question. Most prisoners remained silent or hostile during interrogations. O'Brien nodded and leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped on the small table between them. "Before we begin, can you tell me about the Filipino family? The Delgados. They were caught in the crossfire when my tank was captured. Maria, the mother, was wounded. Her children, did they survive?" The question hit Yamamoto like a physical blow. Here was a man facing execution, and his first concern was for civilians he'd never see again. I don't know about any family. Maria had a piece of shrapnel in her shoulder. Her boy, maybe 8 years old, was crying. The little girl couldn't have been more than 5. O'Brien's voice carried a pain that transcended language barriers. "My crew was trying to get them to safety when your forces overran our position. If there's any way to check on them." Carlos cleared his throat softly. "Commander, I know the Delgado family. They survived. The mother's wound healed well." The relief that washed over O'Brien's face was so profound that Yamamoto felt his own throat tighten. This man genuinely cared about the fate of strangers, even from his prison cell. "Thank you," O'Brien whispered. "Thank you for telling me." Yamamoto studied the American's face, searching for signs of deception or manipulation. Instead, he saw something that reminded him painfully of his father, a man who had always put others' welfare before his own. "Sergeant O'Brien, your tank, the modifications you made, this was against your military regulations?" O'Brien's smile was sad, but unashamed. "Yes, sir. Completely against regulations. But regulations don't help when you're watching people bleed to death, because there's no medic nearby. My crew and I, We figured our tank could carry a lot more than just ammunition. You treated Japanese wounded. We treated anyone who needed help. O'Brien's voice was matter-of-fact. Pain doesn't have a nationality, Commander. Neither does a mother's love for her children or a soldier's desire to go home. Yamamoto felt something shift inside his chest, like ice beginning to crack. My brother died when his tank was destroyed by a Sherman 2 months ago. He expected to see satisfaction in O'Brien's eyes, or at least indifference. Instead, the American's face crumpled with genuine sorrow. I'm sorry. Truly sorry. Was he young? 22. He wanted to be an engineer after the war, build bridges instead of destroying them. O'Brien was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. My younger sister wants to be a teacher. She's 20, writes me letters about her students, how she wants to help them see beyond the borders on maps. He looked directly at Yamamoto. Your brother and my sister, they would have liked each other, I think. They both believed in building things. The words hung in the air between them, carrying a weight that neither man had expected. Yamamoto found himself thinking about the photograph in O'Brien's tank, the little girl with bright eyes and an innocent smile. This man understood what it meant to love someone more than your own life. Why? Yamamoto asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why risk everything to help your enemies? O'Brien leaned back in his chair, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. Because the moment we stop seeing each other as human beings, we lose everything worth fighting for. My daughter back home, she's going to ask me someday what I did in this war. I want to be able to tell her that I never forgot who I was supposed to be. Carlos translated quietly, though Yamamoto had understood every word. The simplicity of the answer and its devastating moral clarity left him speechless. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, promising another night of rain. Tomorrow, O'Brien would be transferred to Manila. And then, Yamamoto didn't want to think about what came after Manila. He stood abruptly, the interview officially over, but nothing resolved in his heart. The revelation came during their third conversation, delivered so quietly that Yamamoto almost missed it. They were discussing the tactical differences between Japanese and American tank design when O'Brien mentioned a specific engagement near the Ormoc Valley. The date he gave, September 15th, made Yamamoto's blood turn cold. You were there? Yamamoto's voice came out as barely a whisper. At the river crossing? O'Brien nodded slowly, his eyes suddenly wary. My tank was part of the advance column. We encountered heavy resistance from dug-in Japanese positions. He paused, studying Yamamoto's face. You know something about that battle? My brother. The words felt like stones in Yamamoto's throat. Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamamoto, Type 97 tank, hull number 473. He died at that crossing. The color drained from O'Brien's face. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The weight of their shared history hung between them like a physical presence, terrible and inescapable. They had been enemies on that day, separated by steel and circumstance and the brutal mathematics of war. The tank that was dug in behind the fallen tree, O'Brien said finally. We engaged it at approximately 1400 hours. The crew, he stopped, unable to finish. Fought to the end. Yamamoto's voice was steady, though his hands trembled slightly. Hiroshi would have died trying to protect his men. It's who he was. O'Brien leaned forward, his face etched with pain. Commander, there's something you need to know. After the engagement, we found survivors. 2 members of your brother's crew were still alive when we reached them. We pulled them from the wreckage and treated their wounds before turning them over to the Red Cross. The words hit Yamamoto like artillery fire. Survivors? but the report said there were no survivors. There were two, badly burned, but alive. My crew, we worked on them for over an hour, used most of our medical supplies. O'Brien's voice was thick with emotion. I don't know what happened to them after we transferred them, but they were alive when they left us. Your brother, he saved them. We could see where he'd pushed them toward the escape hatch before the final explosion. Yamamoto stared at O'Brien, his mind reeling. Hiroshi had died a hero, but more than that, he had been honored by the very men who had killed him. O'Brien's crew had risked their own safety to save Japanese soldiers, turning enemies into patients without hesitation. Why are you telling me this? Yamamoto asked. Because you loved him, and because I have a brother too. O'Brien's smile was sad and knowing. We're not so different, you and I. We both understand what it means to carry someone else's memory. Over the following days, their conversations deepened beyond anything Yamamoto had imagined possible. They discovered that O'Brien's tank modifications hadn't been unique. Several American crews had made similar changes, creating a network of mobile aid stations that saved lives on both sides of the conflict. O'Brien spoke of Filipino families they'd helped evacuate, of Japanese wounded they'd treated, of moments when the machinery of war had been transformed into instruments of healing. My crew chief, Tommy Rodriguez, he lost his cousin at Pearl Harbor, O'Brien explained during one of their talks. Hated everything Japanese for months. But the first time we pulled a wounded Japanese soldier from a burning tank, something changed in him. He worked harder than anyone to save that boy's life. Said afterward that revenge never brought his cousin back, but maybe saving someone else's cousin was a start. Yamamoto found himself sharing stories of Hiroshi, how his brother had always been the gentle one, more interested in fixing things than breaking them. How Hiroshi had volunteered for tank duty not out of aggression, but because he believed he could protect his crew better than anyone else. O'Brien listened with the attention of someone who understood that these memories were sacred territory. Their growing understanding felt like a small miracle in the midst of mechanized hatred. Here, in a prison camp surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, two enemies had discovered they were simply men who missed their brothers and worried about their families. The war that had driven them apart seemed increasingly absurd when measured against their shared humanity. But on the seventh day of their conversations, Lieutenant Sato arrived with news that shattered their fragile hope. His face was pale, his hands shaking as he delivered the telegram from Tokyo. New orders had arrived regarding American prisoners. All captured tank crews were to be executed at dawn as war criminals. No exceptions, no delays. Furthermore, Sato read from the official directive, all evidence of American tank modifications must be destroyed immediately. Such information could undermine troop morale if disseminated. The words fell like hammer blows. O'Brien would be dead within 18 hours, along with every other American tanker in Japanese custody. The tanks, with their medical modifications, would be stripped and destroyed, their message of hope erased as if it had never existed. That night, Yamamoto sat alone in his quarters, staring at the blank report form that would seal O'Brien's fate. Outside his window, rain began to fall again, washing the world clean, while his soul felt dirty beyond redemption. The report form remained blank as midnight approached, its white surface mocking Yamamoto's paralysis. Each word he might write felt like a betrayal, either of his oath to the Emperor or of the truth that had shattered everything he believed about this war. The rain outside his window had intensified, drumming against the glass with the relentless rhythm of a countdown. Carlos appeared at his door without announcement, carrying 2 cups of tea and the weight of unspoken understanding. The Filipino translator had been quietly observing the transformation in Yamamoto over the past week, watching as certainty gave way to something far more complicated and human. You cannot sleep either, Carlos observed, settling into the chair across from Yamamoto's desk. His voice carried the exhaustion of a man who had seen too much suffering to maintain illusions about the nobility of war. How do you do it? Yamamoto asked, accepting the tea gratefully. How do you maintain hope when everything around you is destruction? Carlos was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands wrapped around his cup. When he spoke, his voice carried the accumulated wisdom of someone who had lost everything, yet somehow kept breathing. I lost my son to Japanese bombing 2 years ago. Miguel was 15, wanted to be a doctor like his grandfather. He was helping at the clinic when the planes came. Yamamoto felt his throat tighten. I'm sorry. 6 months later, American artillery killed my daughter Elena. She was 19, a teacher at the village school. She was reading to children in a shelter when the shell hit. Carlos's voice remained steady, though his eyes held depths of grief that Yamamoto recognized. For a time, I hated everyone in uniform. Japanese, American, Filipino guerrillas. It didn't matter. They all seemed like machines designed to destroy what I loved. The older man sipped his tea, gathering his thoughts. But then I started translating for both sides. I heard Japanese soldiers crying for their mothers as they died. I watched American medics risk their lives to save wounded civilians who couldn't even speak their language. I realized that the uniforms were just costumes in a play that none of us really understood. But the orders, Yamamoto said, gesturing toward the blank report. The loyalty we owe. To what? Carlos interrupted gently. To emperors and generals who will never hold their dying children? To causes that sound noble until you see what they cost in human hearts? He leaned forward, his eyes intense. Commander, my children are dead. Nothing I do will bring them back. But O'Brien's daughter is still alive. His sister is still teaching children to see beyond the borders on maps. That has to mean something. Yamamoto stared at the report form, seeing not blank paper, but crossroads. Every word he wrote would echo forward into a future he couldn't predict. If he documented O'Brien's war crimes, the medical modifications, the treatment of enemy wounded, the dangerous compassion, he would guarantee executions at dawn. If he told the truth about American humanity, he would be signing his own death warrant for treason. There's a third option, Carlos said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. You're an engineer, Commander. Engineers solve problems. The solution came to Yamamoto slowly, like dawn breaking through storm clouds. He picked up his pen and began to write, each character chosen with mathematical precision. Instead of documenting American cruelty, he detailed their strategic weakness, an excessive focus on soldier survival that diverted resources from offensive capabilities. The medical modifications became evidence of American commanders prioritizing evacuation over engagement. The treatment of enemy wounded suggested a dangerous sentimentality that could be exploited in future battles. Most importantly, he classified the captured Americans as valuable intelligence assets, requiring immediate transfer to the Prisoner Intelligence Facility in Mindanao, a camp run by officers who had studied in America and understood the value of keeping enemy personnel alive for ongoing interrogation. As he wrote, Yamamoto felt his brother's presence like a hand on his shoulder. Hiroshi, who had dreamed of building bridges, would have understood this particular act of construction, using words to build a path between destruction and mercy. At 3 a.m, he sealed the report and walked through the rain to O'Brien's cell. The American was awake, sitting quietly in the darkness, as if he'd been waiting. Through the bars, Yamamoto handed him a small package wrapped in oilcloth. Your daughter's photograph, he said softly. And this. The second item was his own family photo, himself and Hiroshi at a festival 2 years ago, both of them laughing at something their father had said. O'Brien accepted the gifts with hands that shook slightly. Commander, your crew will be transferred in the morning. Tell them that their modifications have been classified as evidence of American strategic doctrine. They're too valuable for—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "And you?" O'Brien's question carried, more concern than a prisoner should show for his captor. "I'll face whatever comes." Yamamoto straightened his shoulders. "But tonight, I can still choose who I want to be." As he walked back through the rain, Yamamoto felt lighter than he had in months. The report that would save O'Brien's life sat on his desk like a small revolution, proof that even in the machinery of war, individual conscience could still function. His brother would have approved.